Hello everyone and welcome to Chapter 2. Chapter 2 deals with attitudes, definition, and structure. And the first portion of this chapter defines attitudes and discusses the main components that are involved in attitude formation. The second portion of the chapter deals with the structure of attitudes, ambivalence in terms of attitudes that do not align together, and how people manage to cope with these inconsistencies. The third portion of the chapter will deal with the psychology of strong or deeply held attitudes. So let's get started. According to Allport, attitudes and studying attitudes and knowing the importance of attitudes in terms of the behavior connection is a very valuable thing to do, especially for those of us that plan to be working in corporate environments, that plan to be developing media messages that may be reaching large audiences, or even if we just plan to give professional public speeches in our area of career choice, knowing the importance of attitudes is something that will assist us greatly. Attitudes are social and psychological cues about the way that people perceive the world. Attitudes also tend to indicate a person's state of mind, the types of ideologies that are important to them, as well as some of the types of symbols or symbolisms that may be influential and persuasive when seeking to persuade people who have certain attitudes or that have a certain state of mind. Attitudes generally include the views or the beliefs that we have towards certain topics, people, and issues. Now, obviously, a belief is something that is more cognitive in nature, so I might believe that people should take care of the environment, right? However, the way that I feel about something is more of an attitude. So I feel strongly that people who are doing their part to try to preserve the earth and recycle and minimize global warming, I feel that that's a positive, favorable thing to do. I have a good attitude or a positive attitude towards people that live in that manner, right? Now, the flip side of that would be that people who are wasteful with environmental resources or that do things which pollute the earth, I would have a negative attitude. It would follow that, most likely, right? So generally speaking, attitudes are the views and feelings that we have towards certain topics, people, or issues. Sometimes our attitudes are positive towards people or issues or topics. However, sometimes we also have negative attitudes, right? And in fact, depending on the topic or the issue, and in some situations, I may have positive and negative attitudes. And this represents a case where we may have some ambivalence going on about the attitudes that we have. And in this chapter, we're going to discuss later on how people tend to manage or reconcile these differences that can sometimes happen when people have attitudes that may not always align with each other or may not be consistent. Now, it's also possible that people have ambivalent attitudes, okay? Ambivalent attitudes represent a situation where you may have attitudes that go against each other, just like I was talking about. So I might feel favorable towards something in one situation, but in another situation, it may be something that I feel very negative towards. And so when we find ourselves in these kinds of attitudinal ambivalent zones, it can be challenging. And more importantly, in terms of our ability to persuade other people, we need to know and accept the fact that it may not always be as cut and dried as having a positive attitude or a negative attitude. And so if you know, for example, that college students may have ambivalent attitudes towards excessive drinking behaviors, right? Because on one hand, they may know that excessive drinking or binge drinking is a dangerous thing to take part in, right? But on the other hand, there's also the fact that these types of social rituals and these types of social interactions tend to make people feel like they're a part of something greater than themselves. It may be expected in the social group in which they hang out. Looking at issues in this way, the fact that people may be holding both positive and negative attitudes about the same issue helps us to target people more effectively in terms of adopting a new attitude or changing an attitude, belief, or behavior. So this is why we want to be cognizant of the fact that attitudes are not always so black and white, positive or negative. Oftentimes people may have both positive and negative attitudes or beliefs going on about the same issue, and of course this creates ambivalence. Now, as we know from the research and even from our own experience in life, attitudes influence the thoughts we have, the beliefs we carry around, and the beliefs that we reinforce. And of course, attitudes influence behavior. And that's one of the reasons why we spend time seeking to understand the role that persuasion plays in not only intrapersonal communication within ourselves, but also between people who are friends or family members or perhaps partners. And more broadly, how does persuasion play out when we seek to persuade or reach an audience, either that's in person, such as a public speech in a business environment, or even broader than that, a mass-mediated audience, such as a television audience or a web audience or a newspaper audience or a journal writing audience or magazines or things like that. So defining attitudes and understanding them is a very important part of persuasion, and so let's get into it a little bit further. Now, there are several attitude characteristics that we want to be aware of. The first of these is that attitudes tend to be learned. So, for example, when we are born, we come into the world as a blank slate, right? We don't tend to have strong attitudes or pronounced beliefs about various issues in the world or groups of people. We don't really know where we fit, and over time, as we spend time with our family and with our social groups and with our communities, we learn the different types of attitudes that are expected or that are normal, right? So attitudes are learned, and some of these attitudes involve things like favor or love, okay? So what types of situations do we feel positive about? What types of lifestyle do we feel are correct or morally appropriate? What kinds of behaviors do we condone, and what types of behaviors do we condemn? Okay? These are all things that are learned. And we learn them primarily from our family system. We also learn them from social groups, and we also learn them from our culture and society and the mass media, right? That all works together. So the ability for people to be accepting of difference, right? So let's say that I learn a set of values that teach me to view the world in one way, or maybe a few ways. The willingness or the ability that I have to step outside of my own value system and to look at another person's values and to accept those values as valid for that person, if nothing else, right? That ability to be tolerant and accepting of other viewpoints and lifestyles and values is also something that's learned, isn't it? And where do we learn this? Usually we do learn it from our families. Over time, we tend to branch out as we start to mature. We start to develop our own sense of reasoning and our own sense of perception about what kinds of things we accept or reject, right? And so it's interesting and important just to be aware of the fact that most of the attitudes that we have, in fact, all of the attitudes we have been learned from somewhere. And so you can start to look at the different values and attitudes that you carry about various types of issues or lifestyles or practices, and you can ask yourself, where did I learn these values? Who were the people that taught me to believe this or to think this or to feel this way about this particular issue, topic, person, or what have you, okay? Now, much like love and acceptance are learned, the notion of hate or hate-based emotions like collective anger or collective hatred, also things like racism and other types of isms, whether it's based on national orientation or, national origin, or whether it's based on someone's religion or disability or sexual orientation, all of these attitudes and emotions which are learned, okay, tend to influence the way that we view the world. So I do encourage you all to think about some of the values that you have and which values you think are more pronounced than others, which values might be overarching major values, and what values may be minor values, a little less important, but still playing a role in your view of the world. And start to notice the values that tend to be very strong or very embedded, okay? So strong emotions, strong feelings of favor or negative approval, right? So love, hate, they're on sort of opposite ends of the spectrum, right? So start to look at those attitudes that you have and start to unpack or even just question, remind yourself, where have I learned these values? And the follow-up to that is, how do these values operate in my life today, right? Do these values shape the way that I approach people, or whether I approach or avoid certain people? Do these values shape the kinds of opportunities that I allow myself to experience? And furthermore, with regards to this class, how will these values that I hold influence my ability to be an effective persuader in a modern globalized world? Attitudes are also involving judging and feeling. So what this means is that we are judging, which is of course a cognitive process where we're making an evaluation about someone or something or an issue. And the other part of that is the emotions, which is more affect or in the heart. So you have attitudes as sort of a perfect mix of cognition and feeling. And sometimes the way we feel about something may contradict what we think about it, and vice versa. And it's important to be aware of that tendency in humans so that you can attempt to address people who may have opposing experiences with regards to an issue. The third thing we want to be aware of is that attitudes influence our thoughts, and they also do influence behaviors. There has been ample research that has already been done that has verified that the attitudes we carry are very powerful predictors of what we end up doing in life. And so it's very important to gauge our own attitudes as well as the different attitudes that may exist in the people that we seek to persuade. Attitudes tend to be fairly consistent over the course of one's life. Later on in this chapter, we're going to look at ways that we can change attitudes. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is the fact that it's more realistic for us to seek to change attitudes in small segments rather than to have a drastic change in attitude, because people do not tend to change strongly held attitudes very quickly. They tend to make changes in attitudes very gradually, and they make small changes gradually. So what we're trying to do, if we are seeking to change attitudes or behavior, is we're going to try to bring people a little bit closer to a different way of thinking rather than drastically altering them from one side of the spectrum to the other. And so these attitudes are fairly consistent. They do organize the way that we view the world, and they do tend to shape the way that we relate to people, both in terms of our communication on a day-to-day basis, but also the way that we might relate to people in a persuasive setting. So these are all things that we want to be aware of in terms of attitude characteristics. So, what are the differences between values and beliefs? Well, values are much more broad than beliefs. Values tend to be perceived desirable end states of the world, of ourselves. So for example, one value that many people in the USA value is freedom. That's the value that our country was founded upon. And so this is something that still tends to resonate pretty deeply for most people who are from here and maybe live here and immigrate here and things like that. Equality is another type of a value that people might have. Integrity or love, okay? These are more broad perceptions, broad ideas about the way we would like the world to be. Now, beliefs are much more specific, and beliefs tend to be more fact-based. So there are two types of beliefs. One of these is descriptive beliefs, and descriptive beliefs are basically perceptions or conclusions about the world that we all carry around in our head, okay? Prescriptive beliefs, on the other hand, are beliefs about the way that the world should be or how people should be, okay? So, for example, some types of descriptive beliefs may be something as if, let's say, an example from your book is, let's say, maintaining a vegetarian diet improves your state of mind or improves your health. That would be a descriptive belief. That's a view of the world. The reality is that if you eat more vegetarian food or if you minimize meat and saturated fats, then you will be healthier. So that is a view that we have about reality or the world. Now, the prescriptive belief associated with that belief would be, therefore, people should work to minimize their meat consumption and eat of diet that's high in beans, legumes, fruits, and vegetables, and things like that. But another type of a prescriptive belief could be something like, well, people should vote in every election, or the minimum wage should be increased to $10 an hour or $15 an hour or whatever, right? There's been a lot of discussion about that issue recently. So it's interesting to look at the difference between beliefs and values. And the focus on the study of persuasion, however, has really primarily been more oriented towards attitudes. And this is because the idea of the attitude is a concept that has allowed people from cognitive approaches connect with people who do more behavioral research as well, okay? So when we look at the way that people might be influenced by society, we can conclude that generally these attitudes are socially learned and cultivated, and we also know that attitudes tend to shape the way that people behave, okay? So although values and beliefs are related, values tend to be much more broad, beliefs are more specific, and for the purpose of this course, we will be focusing on attitudes. One of the attitudinal models that we want to be aware of and to understand is the expectancy value approach. The expectancy value approach suggests that when an attitude is being formed, that people are drawing from both beliefs and evaluations, or the head and the heart, okay? So when you look in your textbook on page 50, you'll see figure 2.1, and figure 2.1 is a model that was developed to create a visual representation of what the theoreticians believe is happening in this situation, okay? So the people who formed this model were Fishman and Ashton in 1975. I have actually referenced this model in my research. There's been a lot of research that's drawn from this model. And what's interesting about this model is that it allows us to understand what can possibly happen when people have attitudes and beliefs that maybe don't align. So why is it, for example, that teenagers continue to pick up smoking cigarettes at an alarming rate in their teen years when there is ample evidence and scientific knowledge about the fact that cigarette smoking, or in this case, even vaping, right? Because nowadays people are doing vaping instead of cigarettes. But despite the fact that there's knowledge that it's unhealthy, we see that people are still adopting behaviors that are detrimental or damaging or dangerous. So when we look at the model, we see that attitude formation is depicted as a very large circle. And inside of the attitude circle, we see a circle for beliefs, and then we see a circle for evaluations. Now, if somebody has a belief and an evaluation that go together and that are internally consistent with each other, there should be no problem in persuading or evoking the desired outcome. However, as I said a few moments ago, the reality is that oftentimes our head and our heart are not in alignment in terms of the content of these perceptions. So I may have a belief that smoking cigarettes is dangerous, okay? I may know this, all right? Maybe I've seen the pictures or the advertisements or the commercials, or, I've seen those persuasive ad campaigns where you see someone who's, smoking a cigarette and they have to breathe through something that's in their trachea, right? They have like a funnel they have to breathe through. We've all seen that cigarette ad, okay? It is persuasive. It does reify the fact that we know it's dangerous. However, there's an emotional component to it. And that emotional component sometimes is so strong that it might override the knowledge that we have about the danger of an activity, right? Especially if we're in a circumstance in our life where we feel like we're invincible, right? And so most of us at some point in our early years start to feel as if we could take on the world. We perceive that, the normal health problems or age issues or things that happen to everybody because we are all organic, right? At some point, we might perceive that won't happen to us. And so we might rationalize our decision to, let's say, smoke cigarettes with some friends of ours before school, right? And we might like the fact that smoking cigarettes allows us to feel like we're a part of things, or perhaps it allows us to feel relaxed, right, emotionally, or it allows us to connect with people that we might not connect with otherwise if we weren't able to have a cigarette or bum a cigarette or share a cigarette, right? So these are some of the emotional affect components that can shape behavior that sometimes may not be ideal, right? And so we can think about this, and we can even think into our own lives and look at situations in our own lives where we have made decisions that we knew in terms of our belief that this was not an ideal choice for me. Okay, I have been there myself, right? So we have a belief that we know something perhaps is not healthy, or we know that it's maybe not ideal, or not, maybe the behavior is not in alignment with our, our ideals of who we should be, right? However, there's an affective emotional evaluation component. And maybe there's something about that activity that we get some satisfaction from, whether it's a physical enjoyment or whether it's an emotional feeling of involvement or being a part of something, or feeling a bonding with people, right? And so because of these types of contrasting issues between the head and the heart, it leads to follow that some people may make choices that go against rational beliefs because of the evaluation that plays out in terms of feeling. How does it feel to us? And what this shows us is that the feeling component of persuasion really needs to be something that you narrow in on when you're seeking to persuade people, whether it's people in an interpersonal conversation, whether it's a public group you're speaking to, or whether it's a mass-mediated message. And you can also look at persuasion in terms of self-persuasion by focusing on that emotional component, or that feeling or affect. What is it, doing in terms of how I feel in my body, or how I feel in my heart, or in my spirit when I do this, or engage in these conversations with people, things like that. So think about this in terms of the expectancy value approach. Obviously, this is something we want to be thinking about as we continue to learn about persuasion, and also as you folks are developing your final persuasive campaign, you want to be thinking about how to best target your audience by accounting for the fact that it's just simply not enough to give people the appropriate facts and information. That's just not going to persuade people most of the time. The reality is that you have to have the ethos, right? Going back to Aristotle, you have to have the ethos, which is, of course, the speaker credibility. You also need to have the pathos, which is, of course, the emotional component. And then you need to have the logos, which is, of course, the logical internal consistency of the message. So let's think about this as we move forward. Another attitudinal model that we want to pay attention to is on page 53 of your textbook. And we want to be looking at the structure of attitudes and the way in which we can look at attitudes through a symbolic view. And figure 2.2 has a model, and where they take a symbol such as HIV, and they have all of these associated symbolisms and conclusions and attitudes that we may have about people that have HIV. Okay, you can look at the model, and these are some of the conclusions or assumptions that oftentimes tend to guide the way that people develop conclusions about other people or groups. So the symbolic attitude perspective is very valuable, because if we know what types of symbols tend to evoke certain responses, we can modify or implement the kinds of symbols that we want to use to hopefully modify or change behavior when necessary. So again, the symbolic attitude perspective looks at the fact that attitudes are not just emotional, but they are also based on ideology or symbolism. Okay, so as a result of learning different ideologies or attitudes based on early experiences in life, people tend to develop very strong attitudes towards their country or their religion system, or even their own ethnic or racial group. Okay, this is where a lot of the ethnic loyalty or racial prejudice oftentimes plays out in terms of symbolic attitudes. Okay, and so we can think about the way that this may shape persuasion. And looking at the symbolic attitude perspective, we can see that we may have certain types of assumptions or conclusions that we make about a group of people, when in fact these types of conclusions may be fairly simplistic and in many cases not accurate. So we want to be very careful about sweeping sentiments that we may have about, in the example with people with HIV, sweeping conclusions or sentiments that we have about those people. So your book gives a model where they look at HIV in the middle as sort of the core issue and associated with HIV is homosexuals, because that was one of the beliefs for a long time, was that this was a disease that originated in the homosexual community. Okay, so that's maybe one perception that people might have. They may also associate that disease with sex, or more specifically, immoral sex. They may also associate that disease with various racial minority groups. Okay, and a lot of these assumptions, they may also assume that HIV is related to drug users, because that is one way that people can contract that disease. So when we look at this model, we see that many of these different types of sweeping sentiments that people may have, okay, which are beliefs, but they're also emotions, all right? And these types of emotions are very strong in terms of the power that they may have over us in terms of how we feel about various issues, and of course, how we respond when there is a behavior or an action that's required or requested of us. So what this model or this perspective suggests is that rather than responding to people as people, sometimes we may actually respond to humans as symbols of a system or a ideology. And we can also think of other types of symbols that may evoke various types of responses in us. So let's think about the U.S. flag. This is a very embedded and established patriotic symbol in U.S. culture. And so for many of you, you may see a picture of the flag, and you may have an association with the idea of, or ideology of, freedom, right? And that may make you feel really positive and favorable and liberated, and that's a positive emotion, right? We might also have, the assumption of the U.S. flag as something that depicts independence, right? And equality, and these are all things that you have most likely positive affect responses to, okay? So in this sense, you're actually responding to a symbol through a series of ideologies and emotions that have become basically symbolically embedded in who you are as a person. And so these types of symbols or icons or things like that evoke very predictable responses, okay? So if you can figure out what types of symbolisms people are responding to, and of course this goes back to targeting your audience, right? Then you can develop the most persuasive campaign or the most persuasive message to persuade them to either see a different viewpoint, or maybe change their viewpoint a little bit, or in some cases even change behaviors. We also see that religious values and perceptions of religion are also shaped a lot by symbolism. And of course, as I mentioned before, ethnic and racial loyalty, among other types of group-based assumptions or group-based emotions, these types of issues tend to also be perceived of and responded to largely through symbolism, as opposed to concrete, hardcore evidence or fact. And this is something we really want to be careful of when we are reacting to people or situations or interactions, because we want to always be giving people the benefit of treating them as people, right? And I'm sure all of you have felt at some point like you were being perhaps maybe stereotyped, or maybe somebody just didn't really see you. And these are things that we want to avoid doing, especially in a globalized world where we are very likely to interact with people who have different value systems or beliefs than us in our normal day-to-day routines. Intra-attitudinal consistency. This is something that Thompson and Perloff devoted a good amount of research to. And what they found is that people tend to actually have ambivalence in terms of positive and or negative beliefs and attitudes. So what tends to happen is that people may have beliefs about the same topic that are incompatible, right? So they may have a positive view of their own doctor, for example, and they may have a negative view of the healthcare system. Another example they give is the contrast between the head versus the heart, right? Or your cognition versus how you feel. So I may cognitively know that people are supposed to have safe sex. I have gotten the education on that. I know the risks associated with sex without a condom when people are not in a safe monogamous situation. However, there may be an emotional component that maybe somebody does not want to upset their partner by requiring them to use protection because of the implication, right? The implication when you demand or expect someone to do that is, of course, that there's a need to protect, right? So there's a cognition that could be positive towards a topic, and yet the emotional component may be negative as well. So when people tend to be in these situations, it can be very challenging, and this is especially a challenge for persuasion experts. When people have an inconsistency with their beliefs or thoughts and the beliefs and thoughts of other people, there is what's called dissonance. And people have a need for cognitive consistency. And we want to have consistency between our own beliefs, our own attitudes, and with the people we know as well. Okay, this is one of the reasons, for example, why we tend to choose people who perceive the world in a similar way to hang out with or to spend time with or to partner up with and things like that. So we could use the example, for instance, that your book provides on page 58 of the origin of the world. So let's say that you're Sam and I'm Samantha. And in this first model, which is depicted by the triangle labeled A, we see that Sam has a positive view of Samantha, and Sam has a positive view of Darwinian evolution, and yet Samantha does not believe in Darwinian evolution. So what we have there is we have a cognitively imbalanced triad. Now, in the second example, they show that Sam and Samantha are friends, and they have a positive view of each other, okay? And then we see that both Sam and Samantha have a negative view of Darwinian evolution and do not believe that that was what caused the origin of the world. So we would see that in the model labeled B, that is a cognitively balanced triad. Now in C, we're going to see that Sam and Samantha do not have a positive view of each other. Sam has a positive view of Darwinian evolution, and Samantha has a negative view of Darwinian evolution. Now, this is also considered to be a cognitively balanced triad. Why is that? Because it does not matter that Sam and Samantha have a different viewpoint about the evolution of the world because they don't like each other. So this is a very interesting model that allows us to look at some of the ways that we tend to deal with attitudes that are different than our own. So what do we do when there's an imbalance in our own attitudes and the attitudes of other people? Well, let's take a look. When there is an imbalanced triad, people can do one of four things. The first of these is we can deny it. We can try to forget about the inconsistency between the support that our friends have towards various issues that maybe we do not support. And we can just try to say that maybe it's just not that important. We're just going to forget that it even happened and just not think about it, okay? That might be one way that you could establish more balance or reduce the level of cognitive dissonance. Is this really a big difference? Does it really matter? We're all here today. Let's move on. A second approach would be to bolster new ideas or to add ideas to the belief. So we might add the idea that despite the fact that we have different views on the evolution of the universe, we actually have so many similarities in terms of how we do view the world that that view in itself is really not a deal breaker. Okay, so we can bolster. Another thing we might do is we might just differentiate. And when people differentiate, they just simply agree to disagree. We might say, well, it's okay. We don't have to agree on everything. Another thing that we might do is we might transcend. Transcending allows people to start to view the issue as a non-opposing stance, or as having stances that are not opposing, even if they look like they're not the same. So we might start to discuss a possibility of intelligent design. So although it's possible that creation happened, perhaps there was, one creator that created the design of how the universe would be playing out, right? That could be one part of it. And then, of course, the evolution component would be the intelligent design part that, of course, came from creation, right? So in this sense, we're transcending these two views by saying it's actually possible that these views might be correlated or connected, and they don't actually have to be viewed in opposing stances. So these are ways that we might try to reduce or resolve cognitive inconsistency when we see it playing out in our day-to-day lives. Social judgment theory is the last theory that we will be discussing in this chapter. Social judgment theory brings an important and different perspective to the study of persuasion because this theory emphasizes that people's assumptions or people's evaluations of a message are not based purely on the merit or the logic of the argument. Instead, this theory suggests that people will compare the advocated position with their own attitude, and in that comparison process, they will then determine whether they should accept the position that's being advocated in the message, okay? So it's pretty interesting because there are several components to this theory, and we're going to go through each of them now. But I think what's valuable about this theory is that rather than emphasizing issues of inconsistency between thoughts and beliefs or attitudes and emotions and things like that, this theory allows us to understand how it is that our cognitive evaluation of somebody's stance will determine whether or not we are willing to adopt their viewpoint or their behavior or whatever it is they are trying to convince us on, okay? And so the social judgment theory suggests that there are acceptable positions that a person may have on a continuum, okay? And you can look at a diagram of the social judgment theory on page 65. And what you'll see is you'll see Model A. And in Model A, you see numbers that are grouped in groups of 10 going up from 0 to 100. And you see that from 0 to 50 in Model A, you see LOR, okay? And LOR deals with latitude of rejection. The LON deals with the latitude of neutrality, okay? And then the LOA deals with the latitude of acceptance. So in this model, we can see that the person's latitude of acceptance, or the acceptable positions that this person has on a given topic, primarily will lie between the 90 and the 100 zone, okay? Now, people also have rejection, or a latitude of rejection, and this is all of the positions that they find objectionable prior to the actual message that's being developed or disseminated. And then there is a range of non-commitment or neutrality. Okay, they're not sure. So what we find in terms of social judgment theory research is that people who have very strong attitudes tend to have a much larger latitude of rejection, or LOR, than people who do not have strong attitudes or who have attitudes that are weaker, okay? So it's important to be aware of the psychology of strong attitudes, and I'm not going to go into the psychology of strong attitudes in much depth, except to say that I want you to read this portion in detail. And strong attitudes tend to be shaped by several things. Some of them tend to be the importance of the issue to us in terms of our core value system. They also tend to be shaped by how ego-involved we are with that issue, perhaps in terms of our activities on a day-to-day basis or what we spend our time doing. Attitudes that are extreme tend to be stronger than attitudes that are not extreme, okay? So for example, somebody who is a liberal on the far left is going to be perceived as having more extreme attitudes than somebody who's maybe more middle of the road, okay? The psychology of strong attitudes also implies that people are able to access these attitudes quickly in their day-to-day interactions with people, so they're cognitively primed to be accessed. And people tend to also have more knowledge about things that they have strong attitudes about, and vice versa. So if I have a lot of knowledge about something, it goes to follow that I will also possibly have a strong attitude about that. Why? Because I feel as if I'm an expert, and so therefore my conclusion is correct, right? There's a few other things that can influence the psychology of strong attitudes, but for the purpose of this discussion, we do want to be conscious of audience members that have strong attitudes, because this will shape the way that we pitch our persuasive appeal. So let's continue in this discussion on the next slide. So again, based on the social judgment theory, people who have very strong attitudes are much more likely to have a very large latitude of rejection, okay? In comparison, in the Model B on page 65, people that have more moderate attitudes tend to actually have a much smaller latitude of rejection. You see that in diagram A, they have a latitude of rejection between 0 and 50% of all stances on a given issue. Whereas in model B, they have a rejection rate or a latitude of rejection of 0 to 20% of all stances on a given issue, right? Now, the latitude of neutrality for people that have more moderate attitudes is much larger. And then, of course, the latitude of acceptance is slightly larger. So you get another 10% or so of acceptable positions. Now, what this means then is that people who have moderate attitudes are more likely to be able to be persuaded than people who have very strong attitudes. But knowing that an audience has strong attitudes, like for example, if you choose a topic that you know people tend to have strong attitudes about, then you definitely want to consult this theory when you design your persuasive campaign, so that you are going to be pitching a persuasive message that will capture the people who have strong attitudes and hopefully bring them a little bit closer to the middle, which is where you want to get them. And according to the research on people with strong attitudes, the best that you'll be able to do will be to moderately shape an attitude change. The people who have the very strong attitudes do not tend to make very large attitudinal shifts, but what you could work on would be potentially doing a gradual latitude of acceptance change, or getting people to adopt new attitudes gradually over time. And with that type of approach, you might be more successful with people who have strong attitudes, using campaigns over a course of a long period of time repeatedly, okay? So again, social judgment theory posits that attitudes shape evaluations. Personal views that we have on an issue or on the stance also shape the evaluation. So what we do when we're faced with a persuasive message is we compare our own position that we currently have with the advocated position, and then we decide. Okay, we're going to compare the advocated position or the persuasive message that we're hearing with the position that we already have, and then we're going to decide, depending on whether it falls within our latitude of acceptance, our latitude of non-commitment, or our latitude of rejection. So what are the implications for persuasion here? Well, as I said before, it's always more persuasive when we are trying to change public belief, attitudes or opinions or behaviors, to acknowledge the opposing position first, decide and discuss the merits of that position, and then present the alternative position that you're hoping to persuade people to adopt with good reasoning about why that position is the superior position as opposed or compared to the other one. So, in terms of persuading, what we want to do is we want to think about the ego involvement of the people that we are persuading. Those people that are highly ego involved will have a unique size of latitude that goes along with that position. What the research shows is that people who are more ego involved with the topic will have a greater latitude of rejection, and they will have a smaller latitude of acceptance. People who are not as ego involved in a topic or issue will have a smaller latitude of rejection and a greater latitude of acceptance. Small or moderate differences between the anchor position, which is of course where we are right now, who we are, what we think right now, and the proposed position will cause change. And this is what I talked about earlier on in this chapter, that we always want to be gauging what are the attitudes of the people that we're seeking to persuade. Because if they already have a very strong attitude that's in opposition to the attitude, belief, or behavior we're attempting to get them to adopt, then the best that we can hope to do in one presentation would be to bring them a little bit closer to the middle, rather than attempting to change an attitude drastically in only one interaction. Okay, but what you can do is you can work to change attitudes or beliefs or behaviors moderately over time through repeated messages and through gauging the way that the audience responds. You can do follow-up research, and you can ask them what they thought of a current campaign. Was it effective in any way? If so, how so? Were there any things that turned them off? You know, you can look at the symbolisms that you used and whether those symbolisms were effective or whether they might have actually turned people away from the message that you wanted them to take. And so looking at these kinds of things We know that there are several aspects that go into persuasion, but as I said before, the large differences between positions will typically not promote change, and this is one of the reasons why it's so very important for all of us to be aware of the values that our audiences have so that we can develop persuasive campaigns or persuasive messages or business presentations or things like that that are going to be effective depending on who the audience is and what their values are. So this concludes Chapter 2. Thank you for your time and attention. I greatly appreciate it, and I will talk with you all in Chapter 3.